Today's video is going to focus on learning. Now, that can be an interesting word because when I say learning, many people automatically think of something like studying for a test or learning a new skill. If I were to ask you to picture learning, you'd probably come up with an image that looks like this. However, when we use the word learning in psychology, we use it in the broader context. Typically, it can be defined as a change in a person's behavior based upon experience. In this video, I'm going to give a general overview of the topic of learning, along with its history, terms, and a basic review of some of the different types of learning. In additional videos, I'll go into greater detail about those different types of learning, so make sure you check those out too. Now, if learning is a change in a person's behavior based on experience, then it's worth pointing out that not every behavior is necessarily based on experience. I know that probably sounds a little bit like a riddle. But another way of saying it is that you do things that you weren't really taught. We refer to these actions as being reflexes and instincts. They are both inherent actions, ones that are largely automatic and not really controllable. A reflex is typically something that happens quickly and involves some type of muscle or motor movement. When I think of a reflex, I think back to when I was a kid and I'd go to the doctor and the doctor would hit me on the knee with one of those little rubber mallet things and my leg would kick out. That was a mechanical reflex. Another great example of a reflex is if you imagine you're in a classroom studying quietly and all of a sudden the fire alarm goes off. It's loud and you notice that your heart is racing and you feel a little panicked. You're startled by the sudden sound of that loud noise and your body's reacting. Nobody taught you to increase your heart rate or breathing when you get startled from hearing a loud noise. It's just part of being a human. Really, it's part of being an animal because a lot of other animals experience this exact same reaction too. Instincts are similar in that they are just behaviors that are ingrained in us that we didn't really have to learn. However, they usually involve the whole person, not just a part of the person, and typically they last for longer also. When I think of instincts, I think of things like how animals migrate, like birds flying south for the winter. Humans certainly have instincts as well. There's an instinct for newborns to bond with their birth mothers. We have instincts that motivate us to seek out a mate, to be social, or even to be competitive with other people. In fact, instincts play a pretty central role in driving our motivation throughout our life. While they may be influenced by our experiences, and we may learn ways to better fulfill our instincts, the instinct itself is present from birth. Outside of instincts and reflexes, virtually every other behavior we engage in must be learned through experience in some way. There are three main types of learning: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. The term conditioning is interesting because it typically implies learning that is done based on making an association. So classical conditioning and operant conditioning are sometimes referred to as being forms of associative learning. I like to tell students that are taking general psychology courses to just think of the term conditioning as being the same thing as learning. The reason why I say this is because it makes it easier when you start learning some specific terms you need to know later, especially with classical conditioning. Observational learning is not considered an associative learning style. Rather, it's considered an example of what we call latent learning. Latent learning is learning that is acquired usually in a very passive way that may not be displayed for a very long time afterward. So in other words, you learn something, but don't demonstrate that behavior yourself until later, and in some cases, much later. All people learn through each of these different types of learning, so don't think of these as being where one style is better than the others. They each are important in explaining how people change their behaviors based on experience. Regardless of the learning style we're talking about, there are certain terms that describe the process of learning that are used when describing them. These terms are acquisition, habituation, extinction, and spontaneous recovery. Acquisition is just the process of learning. So you could say that this video is helping you all in your acquisition of knowledge on learning. Habituation is where you have a diminishment of a response to something that you're frequently exposed to. A great example of habituation that I can relate to is when I found this really great Vietnamese restaurant. My buddy and I would go to this restaurant all the time because we loved the food and it was something that was really different from what we were used to. In fact, we kept going there so much that we started to just get bored of it after a while. At first it was something new and exciting, but now it isn't. For me, that experience has been habituated. I was exposed to it so much that it wasn't as exciting, good, and interesting to me anymore. Extinction is what happens when a connection was learned and then gets broken due to no longer maintaining it. Learning a foreign language is a great example of this. I know a friend that lived in Costa Rica when she was in college. She was fluent in Spanish and actually spoke it more often than she did her native English. However, after college, she came back to the United States and moved to a part of the country where Spanish just wasn't spoken too much. She didn't maintain her language skills in Spanish, and over time, she started to have problems speaking it. For her, the ability to speak Spanish started to be extinguished. This goes back to that saying, if you don't use it, you lose it. Well, she didn't use her Spanish anymore, so she started to lose those skills. This is extinction in action. Now, what's interesting is the same friend then decided to take her family on a trip back to Costa Rica to show them around. Before the trip, she started to freshen up a little bit on her Spanish skills and noticed it was coming back to her a little better. However, when she arrived in Costa Rica and was surrounded by Spanish, she discovered that her ability to speak Spanish came back very quickly. This is an example of something called spontaneous recovery. Let me give you another example of these terms in action. Imagine a kid that's learning to ride a bike. At first, they're really scared, and the kid's parents have to show the kid how to ride a bike. Maybe at first they start with training wheels, then work up to where the kid is able to do it all on their own. This process of the kid learning to ride the bike is acquisition. Once the kid learns to ride the bike, they're doing it all the time. They love riding the bike and they find it really fun and exciting. They do it every single day. In fact, they do it so much that it starts to lose some of its fun. Over time, it starts to become less and less fun and the kid gets bored with it. The kid is experiencing habituation. Maybe this habituation leads to the kid not riding the bike altogether and moving on to something else that is fun and exciting for them, like rollerblading. Over time, that kid may stop riding the bike. Because that activity isn't being performed anymore, they start to even forget how to ride a bike, or at least they may not feel comfortable doing it. The learned behavior of riding the bike for this kid is going through extinction. However, if the kid was forced to ride a bike again, that skill may come back to them pretty quickly. After all, we all know that saying, it's just like riding a bike. To explain how engaging in an activity you haven't done in a while comes flooding back to you. Well, that's a great example of spontaneous recovery. Remember that all four of these terms, acquisition, habituation, extinction, and spontaneous recovery, are used when talking about learning, regardless of the types of learning discussed. So it's important that you feel comfortable with those terms. I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about how our understanding of the different types of learning evolved. The first person to uncover how learning takes place was a Russian physician named Ivan Pavlov. He famously conducted a series of experiments on dogs that led to the discovery of classical conditioning all the way back in the first years of the 20th century. I'll talk more about these experiments in the video on classical conditioning. But essentially what classical conditioning involves is associating something with a reflex or instinct. It's a very passive type of learning, which means that we really aren't aware of it when we're acquiring this behavior. However, Pavlov wasn't a psychologist. He was a physician. The first person to really start exploring classical conditioning and applying it to people was an American psychologist named John Watson. John Watson is even considered by many to be the founder of behaviorism. If you remember back when I did the video on the different perspectives of psychology, I mentioned that behaviorism was the branch of psychology that deals with learning. Since we're talking about learning in this video, please remember that we're also talking about behaviorism. In fact, all the psychologists I'll be talking about today are considered behaviorists. In fact, John Watson is perhaps best known for showing how phobias could be learned through classical conditioning. He did this through an experiment he did on a young child called the Little Albert experiment. I'll talk about this experiment and explain how classical conditioning can explain how phobias are learned in the video on classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was really the only type of learning that we were aware of up until about the middle part of the 20th century, when a psychologist named B.F. Skinner started to conduct a series of experiments on animals. B.F. Skinner was influenced by another psychologist named Edward Thorndike. Thorndike believed that learning could be the result of something called the law of effect. Basically, that we do things because we get a benefit from doing them, and we avoid doing things when there's no benefit. B.F. Skinner explored how this law of effect can influence our learning and discovered operant conditioning in the process. Essentially, operant conditioning is learning that takes place due to a person associating the action as being beneficial or avoiding an action because of the consequences. Operant conditioning is a little bit more of an active process than classical conditioning. A person may be more aware of operant conditioning when it's taking place because they're somewhat making the choice to do something or not do something because of the consequences of those actions. Remember that operant conditioning is still an associative style of learning. So like classical conditioning, you are still playing off instincts and reflexes for the most part. Behaviors learned through operant conditioning can become very automatic also, to the point that they almost become reflexive, and we may not be very consciously aware of them. B.F. Skinner was so influential that operant conditioning began to dominate behaviorism. In fact, many people started to adhere to a belief called radical behaviorism that was championed by Skinner himself. Radical behaviorism was the belief that even really complex higher-order mental functions like language, emotions, and thoughts could be explained through operant conditioning. This belief is not a part of the modern science of psychology, and it isn't even really a part of the modern science of behaviorism either. In fact, a few short decades later, the final type of learning was discovered through the work done by Albert Bandura. Bandura did a tremendous amount of work in observational learning. Observational learning is not an associative type of learning like operant and classical conditioning. It's an example of latent learning. Latent learning is learning that takes place but may not be demonstrated until much later. For example, young children learn things like gender roles, customs, social norms, and even language skills from watching their parents, family, friends, and interacting with people at school. They learn them even though they may not engage in those activities until much later in life. Think of a young kid engaging in pretend play. They may take on roles of their parents or professions. They may even dress up like their parents. They aren't going to have to adopt these adult roles until many years later in their life. That's the other really interesting thing about observational learning. It doesn't have to involve the person directly. Both classical conditioning and operant conditioning involve the person directly experiencing something. With observational learning, it can be done vicariously or through watching other people. Bandura used his research on observational learning to develop a comprehensive theory that explains how behaviorism and cognitive psychology can come together to explain a wide range of phenomena. This theory is called social learning theory and will be discussed in greater detail in the video on observational learning, as well as in other topics we will discuss in this series about things like personality, thinking, and development. If you want to learn more about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning, please check out the other videos I've done on those topics. You can find the links for those videos below. If you're enjoying the series, please make sure to also give me a like and to subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching, everybody. Have a great day.